Well, welcome back officially to everybody. Hope you enjoyed this morning. I'm not exactly unbiased, but I certainly enjoyed it. While you're digesting your lunch, before we resume our robust talk about the impact of demographic change in our final panel of the day, I want to move along with our midday program, a conversation with our gracious and hospitable host, Diana Natalicio, the president of the University of Texas at El Paso. Several months ago, when we began planning our day on campus, I asked if my old friend, the president, would give us an hour or so to answer my questions and yours about where UTEP fits broadly into this symposium's topic. And rarely has one of our host venues been as tightly connected, I think, to the topic of conversation as UTEP is to the topic of demographic change. But also to talk specifically about the state of higher education at present, offline from the main topic, as well as the state of this iconic institution in its centennial year, the successes enjoyed as well as the unresolved issues faced in what are undeniably interesting times. Now, in this way, President Natalicio would be following in the footsteps of others we've had the chance to sit down across from at other symposia, President Lebron at Rice, President Turner at SMU, President Romo at UTSA, and on and on. And of course, President Natalicio, always happy to carry the UTEP flag, kindly agreed to sit down with me. So I'm looking forward to a deep dive on matters that impact all of us here and across Texas. President Natalicio, you may know, is the longest serving president in UTEP's history and the longest serving head of a Texas public university at present. She assumed her post, well, all right. Moderator's first job, don't step on applause. President Natalicio assumed her post nearly 26 years ago to this day, I understand. Is that right? February 11th?
February 11th.
1988, though she has spent more than 42 years on this campus. She arrived in 1971 as an assistant linguistics professor, eventually rose to be chair of the Modern Languages Department, dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and vice president for academic affairs. During her tenure, President Natalicio has presided over a more than 50% increase in total enrollment, from just under 15,000 to more than 23,000. Since 1988, UTEP's annual budget has grown from $65 million to $400 million. One doctoral program has become 20, and research expenditures have gone from $6 million to $84 million. Over just the last 5 years, she has presided over nearly $300 million in new and renovated facilities expansion projects in science, engineering, health sciences, and student quality of life related infrastructure. We'll talk about hopefully all that in the next little while. A native of St. Louis, President Natalicio has an undergraduate degree in Spanish from St. Louis University and a master's degree in Portuguese and a doctorate in linguistics from the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming President Diana Natalicio. Thank you again. Good to be here. So I'm thinking about 1988. I will acknowledge, just out of college. You come on this campus and you take over UTEP. It is a vastly different institution, one imagines, in 1988 from today, as Texas is vastly different, as higher ed is vastly different. Can you reflect on the differences between then and now?
Well, it certainly was a very different environment, I think. And what's always struck me about 1988 and beginning my role as president was the attitude that I think prevailed on the campus and perhaps in the community, which was far too unassuming, far too self-deprecating, I think, for us to be able to succeed in the way that I envisioned would be possible. And one of the things that I remember thinking is, I've just got to stop this whining that goes on.
Whining about what?
Whining about what Austin doesn't do for us, what Washington won't do for us. It's kind of the attitude that somehow we were forgotten out here, and nobody was going to help us. And so if I would throw out the suggestion, let's apply for an NSF grant from the National Science Foundation, oh, they'll never give us money. Or let's go and try to talk to somebody in Austin about doing that'll never happen.
You can be self-defeating, right?
Totally, and we were, I think we were stifling our own development through an attitude that said that we had been given short shrift, we weren't getting what we deserved, and therefore we never could which didn't follow for me.
Yeah.
So the first thing that I think I felt we just had to do something about was to change our attitudes about ourselves.
Yeah.
Our self-esteem was simply not high enough to be a successful institution.
Yeah.
So we had to become much prouder, much more convinced of our own capacity
Yeah.
to excel. And so I think that was one of the biggest issues. The second issue that in 1988 bothered me a great deal, and I think bothered many people on the campus a great deal, was the fact that we're a public university. We're located in a region of Texas that has historically been undereducated.
Yep.
And yet our student population didn't look like El Paso. Now, if you're a public university with a mandate to provide educational opportunities for a population of a region, and if you assume, as I do, that talent is everywhere, it crosses gender and ethnic and socioeconomic boundaries, if you're in a community that looks like El Paso, or in a community like El Paso, you should look like El Paso. And we didn't. Our student demographics didn't align with the demographics of the region.
Right.
We looked at feeder patterns from high schools, and what we discovered was that many more students were coming from more affluent and more Anglo high schools, if you will, and from some high schools in the region, lower income and more Latino, we were getting, in many cases, no students, no graduates.
Let me ask about that. Why is it the obligation of this university or any university in a community to reflect back on the community, the community's image?
Well, in my view, as a public university, not private universities, but
Right.
public universities, I think, were established and distributed across a geography to strategically provide educational opportunities for people in those regions. This dates back from 1862,
Yeah.
when the land grant legislation was passed at the federal level, the Morrill Act. Senator Morrill of Vermont said, we need to take higher education out into areas that historically haven't had access.
Yeah.
And, you know, up until that point, 1862, education was primarily private, and it was primarily for privileged young men.
Yeah.
So 1862, middle of the Civil War, and President Lincoln signs a bill that creates land-grant universities. So Texas A&M, so New Mexico State, they're all land-grant institutions. That principle of taking higher education out to the people in
Yeah.
a public way and creating opportunities for the talent that we knew was there
Yeah.
is something that I fervently believe in. You know, when I was growing up in St. Louis, there was no public university in St. Louis. And so when it was my time to graduate from high school, I didn't think I could go to college because the only school that I could go to was out of town,
Yeah.
except for private institutions. And so my initial approach, for which my high school prepared me quite well, was to become a switchboard operator in a large manufacturing company. I majored in secretarial studies in high school. And that's what people believed, the students in my high school, which was a working class high school, that's what people believed we were destined to do.
Right.
And so I went out and got a job as Lily Tomlin of Nordberg Manufacturing, and it was the most boring job I could imagine. And after a couple of months, I realized I've got to do something about this. This
Right.
is not acceptable.
Right.
And so I went to St. Louis University, a Jesuit school, asked them if I could go to school there. They asked me where I went to high school. I told them. They rolled their eyes and said, well, you're going to have to work really, really hard
Yeah.
to be successful.
Right.
And so my own personal quest to find my path certainly is replicated
It aligns with what- right.
everywhere in
Right.
this community.
How do you create adequate access to a university like this for a community like El Paso? How do you message to kids in high school, this is for you, continuing your education is for you? We know the barriers, we'll talk about them in about an hour with our education panel. Within the Hispanic community, there's, you know, not a terribly high school graduation rate compared to other groups, Anglos and on. That the completion rate in higher ed, the enrollment rate and the completion rate is not as high as we think it ought to be. So you're pushing against, culturally, a bunch of barriers.
And in fact, El Paso has succeeded against all odds.
Right.
I mean, we have absolutely broken all the records in terms of, for example, high school graduation rates in El Paso. People don't realize this, are higher than in any other major metro area in the state of Texas. High school graduation rates.
Yep.
Our participation of low-income students in higher education in El Paso is higher than any region in the state. So how does that happen?
Yeah,
Well,
what's
I
the
think-
secret sauce? Because obviously if it was as simple as doing one or two or three things, you'd want to replicate it everywhere else.
Well, that hasn't always been true. And what I think really made the difference was the partnership that we built through the El Paso Collaborative for Academic Excellence. We formed a collaborative with the school districts, the community college, the business community. We all began to work together toward a common goal, which
Yep.
was to raise aspirations and attainment among all young people in the community.
Right.
Many people said to me initially, why don't you just put in a charter school, or why don't you just do a university school or something like that,
Right.
a pilot school? And the problem with that is that it's a boutique solution.
Self-limiting, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it helps all the children who are enrolled in that school markedly, but everybody else remains exactly where they are. So you have to engage in systemic reform.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. We went out, we formed partnerships with the school districts, the community college, everybody working together toward a common goal, setting high aspirations and believing in the
Yeah.
talent in our own community. And that was huge, that attitude that we really do have highly talented young people in this community. Let's
Right.
educate them and let's help them succeed. And so that's really where we got started. And that collaborative still exists today, that partnership. We work together every 2 months. We get together, the superintendents, the president of the community college, my great colleague here, William Serrato, who has come to El Paso and has just brought so much value to the relationships
Yep.
that we have. The superintendents of the school districts, business leaders, we all come together and we work very, very hard to build one important thing, and that's trust. Because in the old days, we blamed each other. We blamed the school districts for not sending us the
Right.
students,
Adequately
the graduates,
educated
right?
kids.
The
yeah.
graduates that we wanted as
Yep.
our initial students, and they blamed us for sending them teachers who weren't able to deliver on whatever promise
Right.
we made.
And the business community probably was unhappy that
They blamed us
the
all.
workforce you were producing was not
Right.
right, both public and higher ed.
Right.
So the growth that I alluded to of UTEP, the population, the student enrollment, student population growth over these years, it's impressive, but it's also a ticking time bomb if not managed properly, because managing growth for presidents of universities like this one can really be all-consuming, and you want to be sure that in the course of creating greater access and greater opportunity, that you're not somehow debilitating your ability to provide a product anybody would want. So
Well,
talk
that's
about that.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think it's important, though, to note one important factoid here is that today UTEP student demographics do mirror the demographics
You were
of
successful,
this region.
right.
So we have succeeded in getting our demographic lineup to mirror
Right.
the community. And that's a huge achievement. Very few universities have done that. That's huge. And it's very hard work, but it was built on trust. And so what I think has been critically important in the growth of UTEP has been that we have done more with less. We were never a free spending
Yep.
organization. We've never had enough money to be that.
And in this environment today especially, you're not going to find dollars on street
Well,
corners
that's
that you
right.
can spend.
We haven't been totally surprised by the kinds of financial challenges that we've faced recently because we've never been very extravagant in anything that we do. We've also had a lot of help in terms of buildings, for example. We needed infrastructure.
Yep.
If we wanted to build a business model, one of the most important things that we had to do was build new revenue streams. And a big revenue stream for us now is research.
Yep.
And that's important because of the value of that diploma that you asked about a moment ago.
Yep.
What we had to do was pair access to the university, and you get that mostly through affordability and outreach. And that means working with the school districts and getting teachers and counselors to encourage and raise aspirations and all of that. But you also have to have, in addition to access without quality and excellence
Right.
is meaningless.
Well, that's actually a fair
Right.
question, because on the one hand, anybody can expand an enrollment from
Totally.
15,000 to
Right.
22,000, but if you do so by diminishing academic rigor, if you essentially make the degree that you receive worthless, You can let all the kids in the world into your school, but you're not providing them anything with any value.
And you know what? That's one of the big debates, of course, in higher education, is there are some for-profits and others who do kind of that.
Right. Any
And
degree is not a good degree.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, that's where the excellence piece comes in. And what I try to communicate to our students is that whatever adjustments we may make in order to ensure that they get off to a good start, and that means we have to provide enriched programs for student success. We've got to help them in various ways, whatever it is that they need. Whatever we do there is not about compromising on standards. It's about making sure that they are capable of meeting high standards, because the diploma that they receive when they graduate from UTEP has to enable them to compete with graduates from anywhere, anytime, any place, anywhere. And so these diplomas that they get at UTEP have to be highly regarded. And so that excellence piece, together with the access piece, is the tension within an institution, because everything takes resources. And so there's a constant pull. Do we invest money in this student support program or in this research equipment? Or how do we do that? Now, the research piece is extremely important because it's not only a revenue stream, but it is also a source of student jobs on the campus. Creates a huge set of student employment opportunities on the campus. Almost all of our students work while they go to school. At graduation, I ask people to stand if they've been employed while they go to UTEP.
Everybody gets that.
The 2 people out of 2,500 who don't stand are looking a little sheepish, you know, because everybody works, right? So if they don't work if they don't get jobs on the campus, they're going to work somewhere. Far better that we create the employment on the campus. Makes more coherent their life, but it also gives them an opportunity to earn and learn in the same place at the same time.
Now you bring up this question of the need that some kids, many kids, most kids have to get resources provided to them while they're here to help offset the expenses that they have. I mean, that's obviously hand in hand with the access pieces. How do you keep the tuition of this university affordable enough, especially in a community that is of lower means than many other communities in which public universities exist? I mean, every university cries poverty. Every university would like to have more money from the state. They'd like to be able to raise tuition without actually having the consequences of having raised it, right? But in your case especially, you really can't raise tuition significantly, even if you wanted to, even if you had the will, because the community of kids who come here, their families really can't necessarily afford it. So what do you do? I mean, that seems like a really difficult puzzle.
It's very, very hard. And I have to, right here and now, acknowledge the remarkable work that people on this campus do. They do more with very far less than at most institutions. I mean, it's really quite a great story to tell. Now, Washington Monthly and other publications nationally notice what's called net price, and this is a U.S. Department of Education's calculation of the difference between the cost of education, tuition fees, books, other educational expenses that students pay, and then financial aid. And they calculate a net price. UTEP, this institution, has the lowest net price of any research university in the entire United States. The lowest net price. $2,543 per year. That's the difference between the cost of our tuition and fees and the financial aid and merit scholarships and all the rest of it that we offer. $2,543 net per year. That's what the average student pays out of pocket, if you will. Now,
so you're not one of those, President, let me just stop. You're not one of those who would say, and the Chancellor is here someplace, I'll ask that he hold his ears when I ask you this question. Are you one of these public university presidents fashionable these days to complain within the earshot of somebody in the media that the state has been declining its share of funding for higher education, and you wish they would go back to Austin and advocate for more money for higher ed from the state? Are you one of those people?
I've been known to point out the fact that that the state appropriations have declined considerably, and that this is a huge issue for an institution like ours. This is very painful We've also been constrained in terms of the amount of tuition increase that we can charge. And frankly, with the reduction, 28% roughly decline in our state appropriations. Steve Murdoch's numbers and my numbers are just about exactly the same in terms of how much our state funding has declined. That's very, very difficult to manage. If I'm at UT Dallas with a student population that's socioeconomically totally on the other end of the spectrum from ours, I can raise tuition. I can do all kinds of things that we simply don't have an option to do.
Do they also have a better opportunity? I mean, again, sort of extending out this question of how El Paso is different from other communities. If you're UT Dallas or you're UT Austin, maybe even if you're UT San Antonio, you may have access to wealth in those communities, private dollars that would augment the available dollars you have on buildings. These are donations. I mean, you know, you've got certain people in this community who are people of means who have been generous to the university, but you may have a smaller pool to draw from.
You know what's interesting about that? I think we should be proud of this too. Actually, UTEP ranks second, and Rhonda Safety is here and can correct me, but among the academic institutions in the UT system, UTEP has consistently ranked either second or third in giving on an annual basis all the development work that we do, because our alumni and our local population, our leaders in this community have been extremely generous. And when people ask me, you know, what would you like us to donate money for? The number one target is scholarships for undergraduate students, because there is no better investment than in talent. And that'll mean more to us in the long run than anything else. We have had specific campaigns for things like research, and we were, of course, encouraged. The UT system had a matching program for grants, for gifts, that is, for research and development of various kinds in science and engineering. And we've done very well with that, and we've built some infrastructure with that. We've also had tuition revenue bonds from the legislature for research. So it all comes together, but it requires extremely tight management. Tighter management than I think most universities are accustomed to. And sometimes when new folks come to the campus, they're a little bit surprised at how tight everything is. But that's the reality.
We hear a lot these days about first in his family or first in her family to go to college. What a transformational experience that is for a lot of these kids, not just for the kid, but for the family, not just for the family, but for the community, for all the reasons that we know. I'm going to just take a guess here and say that you probably have seen a fair amount of those kids come through UTEP over the last couple of years.
More than half of our undergraduates continue to be
first in their families. How do you regard those kids differently from a getting them here, getting them through, getting them out standpoint? What is your strategy for kids specifically who are first in their family as opposed to others?
I think we have a little greater responsibility in those cases to provide some of the support that they may not be able to access in other ways, through their families, through older brothers and sisters, through the ways in which second or third generation college students are able to do. And so that responsibility means understanding our students' needs. And I've participated in a couple of things. Our Vice President for Student Affairs, Gary Edens, is here, and Student Affairs has done some beautiful work in terms of leadership development, in terms of something as simple as an etiquette dinner that I participated in the other day, where we invite students to come and participate in what it would be like to go to dinner with someone who's interviewing them for a job. Because it's not intuitive which fork or knife you use, or which glass, or whatever you do. I was minding my manners pretty carefully that night myself. Yes, I was a table leader, so I had to be careful.
Well, if you're modeling behavior, you have to behave properly. That's it.
I was trying to make sure I got all my cutting right. But you know, these are small things, but they make a big difference in building self-confidence. Young people who haven't had certain kinds of experiences don't automatically know how to do it, and it can cause them to lose faith in themselves. One of the things that we're trying to do in a big way is study abroad. Now, study abroad is typically for people with resources,
Yep.
because they take a semester and they pay and they go for a semester to Europe, often, usually. And what we're saying is, no, we've got to do this a different way. Maybe shorter time,
Yep.
maybe more robust programs, maybe involving faculty. So we have faculty members, for example. I spotted some of them here today. Stacy Sowards is here, who takes students to Indonesia in a program that we are involved in, conservation program. This is an experience of a lifetime, but
Right.
it's through a grant. We're working with an organization called RARE. We have other programs in Latin America where through the College of Health Sciences and Dean Kathy Curtis, we're doing all kinds of international experiences for students. They go to Ecuador, or they go to Costa Rica, or they go to Panama. Now, they don't stay for a whole semester, but they get an intense experience while they're there. It transforms them.
Yeah.
They never are the same
Yeah.
after these experiences.
So this is as much life skills as it is a traditional education.
It is a holistic
Right.
approach. Yeah, we really work hard
Right.
at providing these students with everything it'll take to enable them to go out and compete successfully with graduates in much more affluent settings.
Something that I've always heard you talk about and has been interesting to me, I've carried it around with me in other places where I've talked about higher ed with university leaders, is forgiveness is another thing, right? So you also have to have a willingness to forgive these kids that their path through the university may not be the path that we've always seen. You talked to me years ago, and I've quoted this back to you before, about the local train and the express train. That some kids getting out of college are on an express train, but some kids are on a local train, and that as higher education goes, you have to reward the destination and not be critical of the journey.
Exactly.
Right? So that for many of these kids who come through, and I think, again, as we move toward a Hispanic majority population, we have more and more kids who may be, not just at UTEP, but at other schools, first in their family to go to college. We have to stop thinking about a traditional 4-year graduation rate as a metric for success. Maybe we may have to stop thinking about 6 years as a graduation rate metric for success. Talk a bit about that, because I think people tend to judge. Look, we don't say this with any criticism, but the 4-year graduation rate at UTEP is about 1 in 10. Is that right? Is it still down around 10?
No, I think,
a little better than that?
remember exactly. I think it's closer to 20.
Now it's up,
Yeah,
maybe it's
2.
better.
Yeah.
But the point, so let's call it 2 in 10. But still, the 4-year graduation rate here is not, you'd like it to be higher, ideally.
We would,
Yeah. But you also think that that may be the wrong question to be asking.
and that's the point.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important. I'm glad you brought this up, because it is one of the most difficult issues that we deal with. Nobody really understands what graduation rate measures. People talk about graduation rate all the time, and goodness knows I get beat up with it with great regularity because our graduation rate is low. But what is a graduation rate? Well, it is a measure of how many students in an entering class in a fall semester at a single institution graduate from the same institution 4 years later. But it's at the same institution, and that's really important, because most young people today don't just go to one institution. That is the traditional model. That's
Yeah.
the mid-1950s. You know, that's what people did. Now, when students graduate from community college and they come to UTEP, they don't count in our graduation rate because they didn't start here. You can't count in the graduation rate if you didn't start.
Yep.
So then what happens? We create a new graduation rate called the transfer rate. That's what the coordinating board and others who are responsible for measuring such things have to do. They have to keep adding, they add footnotes to the graduation rate. So
Yep.
you have a transfer rate. The problem is that all we need to do is just track students the way we track everything else that we do in our society. And if they attend 6 different universities, we have a lot of military students. They may have 6 different
Right.
transcripts.
Right.
Why doesn't everybody look at this as giving credit to every single one of the institutions that contributed to their success,
Right.
rather than say, nobody gets credit, because this student didn't follow the traditional 4-year
Yeah.
sequential model.
So let me ask you to put yourself in the mind of someone who's living under that new model, the ideal that you're talking about. What do you think your real, as opposed to imagined, success rate is in getting kids out in 4 or 6 years?
Well, we know pretty well, we've doubled the number of degrees awarded over the past decade when enrollment has grown about 50%. So we're pumping out graduates at a much higher rate than we were before, because we're much better at this. We've got technology now that provides us with data that allows us to understand exactly what's happening to students, where they're facing challenges or bottlenecks or whatever. And so now we can take a look at completion rates, which is what I think is important. And whether they start from the community college or they come from the military, or whether they start at UTEP and go to UT Arlington and finish there, I think we all ought to get credit for having participated or contributed.
Right.
This is the worst possible model, because now a student who goes to community college, doesn't complete an associate's degree, but transfers to UTEP, is counted as a dropout there because didn't complete the associate's degree, comes to UTEP, graduates from UTEP, but doesn't get
Doesn't
counted.
count in your
Doesn't
your
get
deal.
counted in
Right.
ours. That student is gone. That student is a dropout for them, and
That doesn't exist.
non-existent.
Let's assume that the number is 50%. Let's assume the number is 60%, right? Let's assume that the 22% number, whatever it is a false indicator. Is that good enough? And if it's not good enough, what are the impediments to the other 40% getting out? And I'm asking you this for UTEP, but I'm asking you this really more on behalf of all of higher ed.
Well, the real challenge, I think, is if we use graduation rate as the unit of measure, we're never going to really know what that is, because we would have to track all of our students who leave and go to another institution.
Yeah, but I guess I'm less asking about graduation rate than I am about just simply what are we not doing that we need to be doing as higher ed to get kids educated and to get them through the pipeline. Completion is maybe the better way to think of it.
It is, and I think in that sense, our completion rate is up around 60% now.
Yeah.
I mean, what we also know, and this is really important, if you want to look at graduation rates, if you look at the top 10% high school graduates, and by the way, more than 60% of top 10% high school graduates in El Paso, Texas today are enrolled at UTEP. They could go to any public university in Texas, but they're at UTEP. And they've made that choice because I think they know they can get the quality here at an affordable cost.
You like the 10% rule.
It works for me.
Works for you.
It works for me.
Right. Because as you know, there are some people who don't like it so much, but you do like it.
But those students, 4-year graduation rate is comparable to the 4-year graduation rate of any of the other major universities in the state. It's about 70%.
That's good.
So if a student has all the academic preparation from high school and gets a scholarship from UTEP, because top 10% students typically do,
so
they
that if
graduate
take
in 4
the question of their means off the table, it's all good.
You know, people say the issues in education aren't about money. It is about money. It is about students being able to afford to focus their full attention on the work at hand. Now, can we do more? Absolutely. Should we be doing more? And you know, we've got great people who are working every day using these data, pointing out, okay, here's an issue that we need to address. And so we work to address it. We are much more adept at class scheduling now. We're much better at determining degree plans. That's all online. You know, all of that sort of thing. You take all of that procedural noise out of a student's progress, we shouldn't be a barrier to students' progress. We should be the pathway. And so we're working hard on our own systems to try to be sure that we do the best we can to provide a smooth pathway and to take all the barriers out of the way. Students, for the most part, people complain about, you know, entitled students and students who don't want an education. At UTEP, I can tell you, these are the most earnest, hardworking, sincere students in terms of their interest in getting an education, because they know that it is the pathway to the future.
We have a legislative session happening again beginning in January of next year. A year from now, they will have been gavelled in. They won't really be doing real work. They'll still be in that period of time when they're thanking Little Leagues, but nonetheless, they'll be in the building. So a year from now, we'll be back talking about the legislature. What do you want the 2 or 3 priorities from a higher ed standpoint going into that next session to be, from your perspective?
Well, I'd certainly like to see some consideration of increased funding, formula funding. We need resources. We've invested a lot. Most universities in Texas have invested a lot in a lot of different things. We have invested in research, and we've invested in student success. Those are the 2 primary areas. And we need support in both of those.
Yep.
And so, you know, we can get gifts from the private sector, but often those are earmarked for particular purposes and so on. We need room to capitalize on the investments that have already been made.
Right.
We have a wonderful program in the UT system that provides startup money when we're trying to recruit faculty
Yep.
to compete, to buy a big piece of equipment or something like that for a faculty member. So we hire that faculty member, and that faculty member comes in and begins to generate grant funds and all the rest of it, and then we can't give a salary increase because we don't have any money, and pretty quickly another university knows that this person is highly
They
successful.
swoop in.
They poach.
So are you very optimistic? Are you optimistic about the prospect of more funding from the legislature?
Well, I'm always guardedly optimistic about going into a legislative session. I've been through quite a few legislative sessions, and I always go in with the attitude that that right will be done or good will be done.
How's that working out for you?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, and I try not to be the whiner that I used to object to
Right.
years ago.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's a question of trying to make compelling cases. I think Steve Murdoch, you know, I was thinking earlier today, maybe I could have him be the surrogate to testify for me, because the arguments that he makes are exactly
They're your
the
arguments,
Yes,
right, yeah.
exactly.
Right.
And frankly, I think maybe they'd like to see a fresh face, and so maybe Steve Murdoch could.
There's no offense to
step
Steve.
up.
I'm not sure he's exactly a fresh face at the legislature at this point, but I will grant you your point. We have just a couple minutes. We're going to have questions from the audience, and I hope there'll be a lot of questions for the president. I want to encourage you to get up right now and line up behind the microphone. You've done this for 26 years. It is a little gauche of me to ask, but what are you thinking about? How much longer you want to do this? I mean, you have shouldered the responsibility of this campus's success, growth, and all that for a very long time.
Well, you know, I knew this question would come, okay? Because it always does.
have to ask.
And I do realize that this has been an unusually long tenure, but I've had a very good time
You have.
in the process. Most of what I do is joyful. What I usually say when people ask me about this is that I have absolutely no plans to do anything except what I'm doing. And I remind them that my father lived to be 100 and my mother lived to be 91. And so, you know,
You are comparatively a kid. That's
I have a long way to go.
that's it.
Right?
Okay. Last question before I do hope again we get good questions from the audience. You are a St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan.
That's correct.
Why on earth are you a St. Louis Cardinals fan?
Well, first because they're the best. But after that, it would be that, of course, I grew up in St. Louis,
Yes.
and I've always been a Cardinals fan. I grew up listening to Harry Carey on the radio, broadcast the games.
Right.
And he made baseball come alive. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a book about the Brooklyn Dodgers leaving New York and going to Los Angeles. And one of the things that she talks about in her book is that her father, she used to listen to the baseball games on the radio, and then her father would come home from work, and he had taught her to keep score, and so she would keep score the entire game, and then when her dad came home, she would tell him exactly what happened in the game.
That's how she learned to tell stories, right?
That's right.
She was a
said
little
that's
historian. That's
what
right.
became her career as a historian was that narrative of the game. So how many balls and strikes, what kind of pitches, everything. And I very much grew up with that too. I imagined the game in my head from hearing it on the radio. I'd seen baseball a little bit, but all the games were very alive for me through the radio. I like radio a lot for that reason, because I think it triggers imagination. And so we grew up with the St. Louis Cardinals, and it's a great franchise. And I mean, there have been some great players, and Stan Musial was one of them. And when I was in high school, I had a job as a tutor, and I ended up on a Saturday going to pick up my tutoring card, and it was to tutor Stan Musial's daughter.
Wow.
And so I got to go to his house, and I got to ring his doorbell, and I got to have him open the door, and then I nearly fainted, forgot all the friends.
Is that right? Right.
But, you know, Cardinals are part of my story.
Remembering Stan Musial is probably good thing from the standpoint of the work you do now, because even Stan Musial only hit about 400. And it probably teaches you that as much as you swing at the ball, you're only going to succeed so many times.
Well, that's right. And I think it's important to note that he, at the top of his game, I think he was paid something like $100,000. So he was frugal too.
He'd do well. He'd do well in this system, in this state.
Perfect.
At the moment, wouldn't he?
That's what I think.
Right. Okay. Good. All right, President. Let's open up the floor to questions from the audience. Where's that kid? Get it back up here, kid. He's going to ask you a physics problem, I suspect.
Well, I hope
sir.
not.
Hi, my name's Bill Leff, and I actually have a graduate student's son here.
Great.
And he's on my scholarship plan, my personal scholarship plan.
Is he?
Oh, those are the best.
Yeah, you guys are taking the money right out of my check, but
She
that's
doesn't
okay.
take financial aid applications in person. I'm just telling you.
But I'm just wondering, you know, I didn't realize the lack of support at the graduate level compared to the undergraduate level, and I know you addressed that a little bit, but I'm just wondering, you know, state, federal, private sector, I'm not sure what more could be done to get more graduates, because it seems like today a bachelor degree is fine, but a lot of positions, that's not enough anymore. They want masters, and you know, PhDs and doctorates are fine too. So.
Are you doing enough on providing resources for graduate students?
Not enough. We're working very hard on that. I think it's important to point out we developed doctoral programs very quickly at UTEP over the past 20 years. We've gone from one doctoral program to 20. And with that comes a responsibility to begin to build a base of finance for that. And we rely heavily on federal grants. We create try to create jobs through grants, and a lot of our faculty do that very, very well. But there's also a challenge for faculty who have grants to keep the funding level up. And with federal cuts, sequestration was very difficult, for example. What happens is that graduate student stipends don't keep up in terms of cost of living and that sort of thing. And so we're working very hard on that. Undergraduate scholarships have a lot more appeal for donors than graduate scholarships. There's something about undergraduate students and, you know, kind of pulling yourself up and opportunities and all that. And so this is something that we're doing a lot of thinking about and trying to allocate funds. But our graduate programs have grown much faster than at most institutions. Most institutions would have had 50 years to do that kind of doctoral program development. Once we had the go-ahead from the coordinating board, we were prohibited for a long time from doing doctoral programs or any more than one. And so once we got the open window, we had to hurry up and try to establish ourselves. And so it's been a real challenge, and we're quite sensitive to that, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because it is something that I think points to the kind of support that the legislature might want to begin to think about. Because of the investment in research at most universities, this is a huge economic opportunity for the state to develop commercializable technologies and all that sort of thing. But if we can't fuel that engine of innovation and so on, and that involves graduate students, we're going to squander much of the investment that we've made. So that's very high priority. Thank you.
Sir.
All right. First, I'd like to
He grew
thank
taller.
He did. That's not the same kid, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you and all your colleagues. I know you've been working really hard, and UTEP has become a lot better than what I used to know even when I was a kid, like, this thing. But it's
That must have
gotten
been a
much,
long
much, much
time
better,
ago.
and it's still getting better. And So my question is, I know I've been hearing a lot about UTEP trying to become a Tier 1 university, and this is more just so I can find out, but what exactly is UTEP's strategy to become a Tier 1 university?
And what would the impact of that be on your ability to execute upon your goals?
Well, I think what's important to realize is that there is no official group of Tier 1 universities. Tier 1 really is a reference to kind of the arena in which you do your work. Who do you compete with in research, for example? What kind of rankings are you getting? Who's recognizing the work that you're doing? What kind of recognition are your faculty getting? And so there is a group of universities that are called research universities. We're one of those. And you just keep inching up, right? And UTEP has made huge progress in that regard. I mean, we've gone to 80 million plus a year in annual research expenditures. That's up from something like 5 million in 1988. So it's huge growth. We rank 4th, I believe it is, this year in Texas among all public universities in annual research expenditures. That's dynamite. That surprises everybody. So those are the kinds of kind of benchmarks that you look at. Who are we competing with? And who's trying to recruit our faculty? Why are they trying to recruit them? Because they're very, very good, not because they're not performing well, right? And so what Tier 1 really does, and Tier 1 isn't, most people don't talk about Tier 1 other than use it as an adjective. It's a Tier 1 research university, that sort of thing. And it just means you're playing at a high level. UTEP is very much doing that. But we're doing it, and what makes UTEP special is we're doing it in an environment where nobody would have ever predicted that it could have been done, right? Research universities are supposed to be done in places like Boston or like Stanford or something like that, but they're not supposed to be on the U.S.-Mexico border, and they're not supposed to be at universities with the strong access commitment that we've made. Mm-hmm. So it's that combination of access and excellence that people say can't be done. I've heard 1,000 times, almost as often as people talk to me about graduation rates, they talk to me about the fact that access and excellence cannot be done. You can't have both. In order to have excellence, you've got to restrict admission. Yep. You can't admit students who don't have super high SAT scores. When we know that SAT scores do not predict performance at UTEP or at most universities, there are tons of studies that show that, but it's a prestige factor. We're not going to use a test that we know doesn't predict to keep people out. That would be a bad thing to do. So it's that combination of access and excellence that makes UTEP special. And I would say, as I said in my opening comments, I think we're very much at the point, the tipping point in achieving our Tier 1 goals. We set 2 goals. One was 100 doctoral degrees granted per year. We already did that. And $100 million in annual research expenditures. We're at 84.
Close.
So we're close. So those were our goals. And that was what we thought we should set as benchmarks.
Another time, because I'm a parent of a high school junior, I'm going to ask you why we're bothering to force these kids to take the SAT then, if they don't matter. But
so that the College Board can stay in business.
It hits me personally. Mr. Moore, and I think we're going to have to make this, I think, Agnes, the last question. I think we have to make this one the last question. I'm sorry.
And thank you, by the way.
Mr. Moore.
Dr. Natalicio, you mentioned the work of the collaborative here, and going back to the slides Dr. Murdoch was showing, one of the key things that Texas obviously has to do is close that educational attainment gap between Hispanics and Anglos.
Right.
One of the really innovative things that the collaborative has been involved in is dual credit and early college high school programs. Can you talk about what role that kind of innovation can play in closing those gaps?
Good. We're going to talk more about that as well in the next panel. So,
I'd love to. That has been a huge development here, and one that I think is just absolutely a great example of innovation and of making education far more efficient for students who have neither time nor money to waste. So what happens is that students are able to concurrently earn a high school diploma and an associate's degree from the El Paso Community College, and the community college has done a wonderful job of providing leadership there. We don't try to compete with a community college in the dual credit world. We recognize that they're doing a great job with that, and why duplicate effort?
Yep.
And as a result of that, these students come to us as juniors, having completed an associate's degree, and they then have financial aid that they can use to go on to graduate school if they want to. It is highly efficient, and I think points to the areas where K-12 and higher education need to integrate far better. The division between TEA and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board from a policy perspective makes it very hard for us to do these kinds of integrative efforts. Dual credit has overcome that, but it's overcome it through a series of steps where the universities and others are accepting these credits. There's a lot more work that could be done there. Our major constraint right now is that we don't have enough dual credit teachers. These are teachers who have to be certified to teach. That means 18 hours of graduate work in the field in which they teach,
Right.
to be able to teach these courses for credit at the community college. And that's where we come into the picture in our teacher preparation program, to add to their credentials so that they can expand their teaching force.
President, it's been fun, as it always is, to get to sit with you. Thank you so much for your
Great.
time. Appreciate it. President Natalicio, thank you. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back with our last panel in about 10 minutes or so. Please don't stray too far from your tables. We'll see you. Thank you.